Let me give you another example. What if I said the vice president is the spare tire of government? The vice president is the spare tire of government. That's making an analogy or a metaphor. Is that metaphor based on how the two separate things look or how the two separate things function? Is it based on how spare tires and vice presidents look, or is it based on how spare tires and vice presidents function? In this case, the metaphor is based on function. The spare tire you bring out when you have a flat tire, when you need to replace something. The vice president takes over for the president if for some reason that president has to be replaced. So if I say the vice president is the spare tire of government, I'm making a metaphor based on function, what something does. So here we have a very complex artwork that might have multiple associations, multiple related meanings, and it might be hard for us to come to a final determination of what this artwork means and say that this artwork means this and only this. Sometimes when you use a visual metaphor, it opens up possibilities. It makes new connections, unexpected connections. That's one of the reasons why I started this lecture with that thought experiment and ask you to imagine a world of pure sound or a 10-dimensional cube. Sometimes what we're trying to convey is something novel, something unfamiliar. Sometimes it's unfamiliar to ourselves. We're in search of those connections. We're in search of that meaning through our artwork. And the artwork that we put out there might be like a first attempt at getting to this idea that we're sensing out there, this connection that we're sensing out there, but we don't quite have it yet. And so then we make another artwork and try and get a little clearer about it. So artworks can be generative, evocative, open-ended, suggestive. And so metaphors, visual metaphors, can open up ideas, introduce us to new ideas. And in fact, that's exactly, it's like an important function of the brain, so we're not trapped with just one set of ideas, but that we can grow. And artwork and responding to artwork has a really important dimension to it, in that it helps us expand our imaginative universe, expand the sense of the possible, of introducing us to new ideas. And visual analogy and visual metaphor can help us do that. Some of you might be familiar with this idea of SCAMPER, which is an acronym that is kind of like a creative thinking tool, so that you might take two or more things and see if you can substitute one thing for another, or combine different things, or adapt one object for a new situation, right? Put something to another use. Well, all of the kind of creative strategies represented by the acronym SCAMPER, underlying all of those creative strategies is the connective tissue of making metaphors, all right? So bridging the gap between different things, or an object in a new situation, putting one thing to a different use. How do you bridge that gap? What is the connective tissue between the two things? Comes down to our brain, our mind's ability to think metaphorically, to think in terms of analogy. Let's look at another example. Here we have a sculpture. We see eyes in a binocular. Is the visual metaphor here based on how two things look, the eyes and the binoculars? Is it based on how those objects look? Or is the visual metaphor based on what those two objects, the binoculars and the eyes, based on what they do? So is the metaphor based on how two things look, or is the metaphor based on what two things do? So in this pretty clear example, the visual analogy or the visual metaphor is based on function. It's based on what the two different items in question, eyes and binoculars, based on what they do. They both are used for seeing. So while the last example was pretty clear, there are times when you don't necessarily want your audience to simply get it that fast, especially if you have folks coming to a gallery. You want people to spend time with your work, and you might want certain kinds of responses, whether you want them to wonder or to question or to reflect or to think more deeply. You don't want it to be drive-by art, something that they just see, they get, and then they keep moving. Willie Cole has other kinds of artwork that I think probably starts to generate new kinds of meaning that might make people reflect or think or wonder a little bit more. It's also a good example of how visual metaphor connects to your artistic research, how research in your artistic practice can develop and lead to very complex artworks. Given that, I'm going to use Willie's artwork, his visual metaphors, these very complex visual metaphors, as an example. I'm going to show you some of the underlying references, some of the underlying associations that he's bringing to bear that are in this artwork that don't necessarily define everything about the artwork, but that kind of form a nucleus of the artwork that allows us to make many different kinds of associations. So in this artwork by Willie Cole, you see him making visual analogies or visual metaphors based on both form and function, based on how things look as well as what things do. If you look on the left-hand side, you see the artwork. If you look on the right-hand side, you see some of his sources. You see some of the ideas and the objects that he's using to make meaning in his artwork, to bring a whole series of associations together to bear, and to hopefully stir some maybe kind of a response in his viewer. The elements that he's working with, his source material that he then transforms into his artwork, include African masks. You obviously see the iron, slave ship diagrams, brands that could be used for branding animals but were also used for branding slaves. Also, some of the basic elements in his artwork that he's drawing on and transforming in his artwork through metaphor, through analogy, tribal markings. So then you start to develop this really complex, intricate web of associations between labor and slavery and branding and human cruelty, as well as cultural identity that's being referred to with the tribal markings in the lower picture there on the right-hand side. And there really is a complex of ideas. We can just take this image of an iron, and we typically associate an iron with some kind of either daily chore or with some kind of labor. We might then think of, well, who irons? We probably don't think of Bill Gates as ironing his own shirts. Maybe he does, but we probably don't think of him as ironing his own shirts. So this idea of the iron as a sign of labor of a certain kind, of what certain people do and what other people don't do, starts to refer us to a whole way of thinking about the world in terms of status and money and power. And that connects to this idea of the slave ship maps, where people were packed in as a commodity in extraordinarily cruel conditions, and taken and stolen from their homes and transported across the ocean. And we also see connections to the culture that they were stolen from, because we can find kind of these vague similarities between the shape of the iron, the shape of the slave ship diagram, the shape of some of the masks from Africa. We also come back to this kind of central idea of the iron as something hot, that if you touch it, you can burn yourself. Well, people were burned. They were branded as being property. So this idea of branding and burning then feeds back into this idea of status and wealth and power. And yet we also have this kind of ongoing connection between a certain kind of mark and cultural identity, which we again have with the tribal markings that we see. All of these elements coming together in really interesting ways in the work of Willie Cole. So this presentation is in connection with an assignment that I give my classes to develop a artwork based on visual metaphor. This presentation hopefully will provide the background information that you need, the background thinking, how you can construct a visual metaphor, what might the goals be in constructing a visual metaphor that you will need to know in order to start working on an assignment where you're asked to make your own visual metaphor.